Okay, let's go ahead and get started tonight. Right on time. Anyway, let's get started with the prayers. Did I pull up the prayers? I think I did. If not, then I'll pull them up. No, I don't think I did. Let me see if I can find them really quick. Should be in my list here. Let me get out of this and pull them up elsewhere. Okay. So before we recite the prayers, we can bring to mind the two thoughts of refuge and bodhicitta, and we'll meditate on bodhicitta as well. But essentially, we are just bringing to mind our own sense of safe direction that we find in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and then generating the motivation of bodhicitta. So let's see, where do I have prayers for teachings? It goes up on the screen. There we go. So yeah, we'll skip the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha tonight and go right to the refuge prayer. And we won't do the mandala offering either. I think that's okay, just to leave that out occasionally. So let's do our recitation. Sorry. I go for refuge until I am enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits I create through listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodong soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho Sangye chodong soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. So let's do a short meditation on bodhicitta. And we'll spend the first few minutes focusing the mind, just meditating on the breath, whatever way you usually do to meditate on the breath. And then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation together. So let's begin the meditation now. So to set our motivation for tonight, let's recall that back at the beginning of this course, we had that diagram that was the tree of samsara, understanding that all the suffering that we experience, as well as even the happiness that we have, all arise from karma. All those fruits arise from the branches of karma, essentially. And then the branches of karma arise from our states of mind, which is what we're mainly exploring in this course, trying to understand which of them are wholesome, which of them are unwholesome, which lead to happiness, which lead to suffering. But all of these are rooted in ignorance. The roots of the tree are the ignorance in particular that we began discussing last week. The ignorance that is especially grasping at ourselves, the person, the I, the self, to exist in a fictitious way. So as we continue our study of this topic tonight, generate the motivation that wishes to not just achieve your own freedom from samsara, your own liberation, but sees the faults as well of only attaining that if we were to be liberated ourselves, attain the state of peace, nirvana, we would be leaving behind countless beings who have been incredibly kind to us and upon whom our own happiness and well-being depends. So instead, we generate the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to investigate this topic of emptiness, how to develop the antidote to this ignorance, with the motivation of becoming a Buddha for the sake of others. If we attain that state, we certainly will have achieved our own welfare. We will no longer be in samsara, trapped by our karma and delusions. But moreover, we will be in a state where we can then help others perfectly, spontaneously, effortlessly. We will be able to guide them on their path to full awakening as well. So in particular, as we look at this topic of emptiness again tonight, generate that motivation of bodhicitta. So what we do doesn't just become the cause for our own welfare, but for the welfare of all sentient beings. And then let's open our eyes fully, and we'll begin tonight's class. So as you may recall, at the end of last week, we did have a wonderful question from Jay in Australia, who is online as well tonight. She was asking about reincarnation and rebirth, and as best as I was able to discern, and hopefully my answer was somewhat sufficient in terms of understanding the conventional rationale, the logic for why reincarnation or rebirth exists, how we can point to the nature of the mind and understanding that this is the way His Holiness always approaches it, is that if mind is not material, if it is not the brain, which is a materialist view that we have still existing in many scientific communities. So according to that, when the electrochemical stuff is going on enough in the gray matter, and when we're in the womb, that's when consciousness begins. And then consciousness would continue until death, when the brain ceases, and then consciousness would cease. Well, that's again based on the fact that, or on their perception of the fact that consciousness is kind of its co-emergent property. It's arising from what is going on in our gray matter. That's not the Buddhist view at all. The Buddhist view is that, yes, there's a relationship between these two things, the physical and the mental, but the mental has its own continuum. And because it's arising from something that is substantially the same as it, a non-material entity we call consciousness that knows, that is aware, it always has a moment preceding it. So we can go back without any beginning. And of course, our minds go forward without any end. Nothing can cease consciousness, can stop it. It didn't come from anywhere, it came from itself, and it was self-generating in a stream of mental moments. So this is the idea behind understanding reincarnation or rebirth. We usually use the term rebirth rather than reincarnation, though you do see it. We even talk about, reincarnated lamas. I think when they use the term reincarnation in the Vedic traditions are mostly looking at the idea of a soul that reincarnates, what they call the Atman. Again, I'll get into a little bit of that in answer to the more ultimate question around rebirth and what have you. But the idea is that that's the conventional explanation, a sort of logic or reasoning for why there are continued existences in the past going into the future, is because of consciousness continuing to, kind of generate itself in a stream of mental moments. So in terms of the more ultimate question that I mentioned to Jay as well, who is it that takes rebirth? Who is it that is reincarnated, if you want to use that term? Again, in the Vedic traditions, they would say it's that Atman, which is essentially the self that you are, a permanent kind of unitary, uncaused phenomenon, similar to what we mean by the soul, I think, in we'd say Christian traditions. I'm not sure that Jewish folks believe in a soul or not. Some of my Jewish colleagues I've talked to on the Interfaith Leadership Alliance would say, no, not really a soul. But the idea is that when I was taught about what a soul was in my Roman Catholic catechism classes, it was this sort of kind of a piece of God, if you will, that was immortal. And that was kind of who I was at my deepest essence. A bit of a kind of unchanging phenomenon, if you will. And what we are in this corporeal form is very different than what that essential soul-like nature is. Well, in Buddhism, there is no soul. They teach anatman, and that was the kind of the coarsest form of a self or a person that the Buddha refuted. He said, no, there is no soul like that. There is no atman. And he challenged people to even say, well, what is the basis for that? I mean, where is that? Remember last week we were talking about how the person is designated to this collection of stuff. Well, the collection of stuff that's here is a body, all the material components of this self, the basis for this self, and then there's the mind being that continuity of awareness. So if you have those two components, where is the soul in that? And so that you can't like take those apart away from what's sitting here and say there's kind of a soul left that you could identify and look at. So again, in those traditions that posit a soul that is taking rebirth again and again, the Atman, well, then essentially they have something that they designate as the true person, if you will, the substantial person that's underneath the surface of all of that. In Buddhism, there is no real person at the core of all of that, as I was going through in last week's explanation. We're going to go into that a little more detail tonight. How if we do the investigation, we find that there's nothing we find when we pick this all apart that stands up and sets itself up as the self, the person. No soul, nothing else that we could find that is the person in all ways. The person is designated, merely imputed. As I said last week, Lama Zopa would always emphasize, it's almost as if the self doesn't exist. Almost as if the person doesn't exist, but the person does exist. Solely through this designation. We think of this as an I, and we have thought of our prior aggregates, as they're called, the physical and mental aggregates, the components of our being. In the prior life, whatever I was, whatever being I was, and whatever existence, I had a sense of an I with regard to that, right? Because if I was a dog or something, and my owner would be calling me and saying, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm here, I am, run over. There's a sense of I that goes with every single existence. A mere I. And of course, the deluded sense of an I, the false sense of an I that is propelling the whole show, as I said earlier in the meditation tonight. So essentially what we have is we have this process of consciousness continuing to, through the force of our karma and delusions, generate more existences. So when we get to the end of a life and the consciousness leaves that body, it goes on propelled through the force of karma to another existence. And that would be a separate rebirth, a new sense of an I, a person, on the basis of our new body and the new mind that is kind of with it. There is a thread of consciousness that goes through all of these existences. But the consciousness we would have as a dog, for example, would be very different from what we have as a human. I mean, look at Bill's dog there in the Gompa, Tai. Very different consciousness there, right? Even if Tai was awake, which he's not, he would be just like kind of looking around and not getting what words I'm saying and being able to understand language and all of the things. Have a very limited perspective. Sure, he's got a much better sense of smell than I do. I'm not denying that. But when it comes to an intellect, dogs don't have what we have in terms of our human consciousness. So however consciousness gets kind of shaped by the existence that we have this still constant of an imputation of a sense of I on the basis of that consciousness together with that physical form, that body. We will have that sense of that being our I until we die and the consciousness leaves. And even in the intermediate state, there's a subtle sense of a self, of who you are as you're seeking out your new existence. And then you take rebirth and you have a whole new sense of who you are on the basis of what your next state of existence is. So this is what's going on. I mean, the Buddha would often talk about how, oh, when I was a Brahmin, or when I was a Ruru deer, or when I was this, or I was that. There's no real I that is those things. There's just a consciousness that is having these various experiences that are being thought of as I. And on the basis of the mere thought of I, there's nothing wrong. But then we layer on top of it again this false sense of an I, that there's something that is real that is there. And we hold on to that as being true. As we talked about last week, that is appearing to us as well. So when we have something we designate as a phenomenon, such as we designate this collection of body and mind as I, if we stopped right there, that would be fine. We wouldn't have any problems because it'd be merely designated, merely imputed. But it immediately comes back at us as if it's real from its own side. It appears to exist that way. This is due to the fact that we've had ignorance since beginningless time. We have these imprints that give rise to a false appearance. On the basis of that false appearance, we then have the third step. We cling to it. We don't stop at just the first step of merely labeled. When it appears back as if it's real from its own side, then we grasp at that as real. That's how we get ourselves in trouble. That's what's perpetuating the whole rebirth show and causing us to cling to a sense of self very tightly as if it were real in each of these existences. So what's happening at a deeper level or more ultimate level is there's no self that is reincarnating or taking rebirth. Really, there's just this continuity of awareness that is being designated as I together with the aggregates, the physical aggregates of each of those lifetimes. So mind and body are the basis for thinking there is an I here, but there's nothing more than that here. There's always a basis for something. I can't say there's an elephant in the room. I know that's a phrase we use sometimes. Don't talk, or no one's talking about the elephant in the room, but literally there cannot be an elephant here in the room because there isn't the basis for an elephant in the room. Right? There's no big, large gray body with ears and tusks and all the other stuff that goes on with an elephant. If the basis is not there, the object cannot exist. But if the imputation of the object is not there, it also cannot exist. It's a mutual thing. It's arising on the basis of a conceptual mind designating a phenomenon to a basis. That is the only way that things exist. So to go back to Jay's question, we can say conventionally, this is what's happening is you have this consciousness that is going through all of these iterations of various experiences on the basis of karma. There's no real I that's going through all these experiences. All the karma is carried, we could say, His Holiness often says, we could say they're like imprints on the consciousness that simply are carried forward. But what's keeping it all going is just the mere I and the fact that we think of this as I, think of that as I. And then, of course, what causes it to be a faulty form of existence, what causes it to be samsara, is that we think it's a real I. If we stopped again at just the thought of a mere I, we would be fine. We wouldn't try to defend this I or protect this I, get what that I wants and what have you. Everything more than merely imputed is an error. So that's the idea behind it. I hope that answered that question satisfactorily. So let's go back into this topic, and there'll be some time for questions. I'll try to end with ample time for questions tonight. I often don't do that, but nonetheless, I will do my best to try to end. Let's go back to the slides, and I did just want to repeat a couple of slides from last week once more to go back to this delusion that we call ignorance. Again, confusion is the term that's sometimes used in our text. And thank you, Sheila, for putting the text in the chat box in case anybody needed to download it. I will be putting some of the text up on the screen shortly. Once more, just to remind ourselves the definition of this. This is from Geshe Rabten's text. Ignorance is an afflicted state of unknowing, brought about by the mind being unclear about the nature of such things as the Four Noble Truths, the law of cause and effect, karma, the triple gem, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and so forth. It has the function of acting as a basis and a root for all other afflictions, as well as the defiled actions and states of birth that they produce. Again, this is a very general term for ignorance. There are many different types of ignorance. As we saw last week, there were two main types. Confusion about the meaning of reality itself, the ignorance that is bewildered about the nature of the self, which is what we've been talking about already so far tonight. And secondly, confusion about such things as the law of cause and effect. And usually that's the one that's highlighted, is that we have ignorance about karma, about how things actually come into existence through the law of karma. So what I wanted to do is to go into how things are existing in a conventional way by reviewing the levels of dependent arising. Dependent arising, I'll take it off screen for a moment to talk about this term. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often talks about how this is the slogan of Buddhism, and that this is what the Buddha taught from the very beginning. Dependent arising means essentially that things arise, come into existence in dependence upon other factors. And this is true for everything that exists when we get down to the deeper levels of dependent arising. At the very first level, though, what we have are all the things that arise on the basis of causes and conditions, which is most of what we deal with in our everyday life, right? You know, all of the stuff that are appearing to our senses, all the things that are visual forms and smells and sounds and tastes and tactile sensations, all of these are arising from causes and conditions. All of our thoughts and concepts are arising from causes and conditions. Our mental processes and so on, they are all caused phenomena. So when we talk about the person as well is a caused phenomenon. It rises from certain conditions. I was talking about them just a short while ago, right? On the basis of karma that ripened in our last life, our consciousness then takes rebirth in another existence and has a particular way of thinking about things on the basis of that embodiment that is a product of our karma, that also being a product of the parents who gave rise to that particular body that we now have, and so on. Many different causes and conditions that come into play for things to exist. So the very first level of dependent arising pertains to those phenomena that arise in that way. And it is essentially dependence upon causes and conditions. Sometimes they use this term cause to refer to the more fundamental cause, like if you talk about a clay pot, it would be the clay that the pot is made out of. That's the more substantial cause. You talk about conditions, and frequently it's all the other things that play a role, which can be the fire in the kiln, it can be the potter's wheel, it can be the potter themselves who are doing that, and so on. That's applicable to what we call impermanent phenomena, which mean things that arise from causes and conditions. Because impermanent phenomena change every moment. There is constant change in terms of their process, everything continuing to arise, to abide, and to disintegrate in moment by moment. This is the nature of all caused phenomena, all impermanent phenomena. That's kind of the grosser level, but it's one that really does help us to begin to loosen up some of our sense of things being a bit concrete. You know, if we kind of understand it, Thich Nhat Hanh had this wonderful way of talking about this called interbeing. Many of you have read some of the books of Thich Nhat Hanh. And so he would say something like, you know, if he took a piece of paper, I'll take a piece of paper out of my tablet here. This one's got some printing on it from where I printed the cover of the book. So this piece of paper, when we see it, again, the appearance is like it's kind of standing on its own, independent of any causes and conditions. But he had this idea, when you see a piece of paper, what we should be seeing is the rain that came down that watered the tree that this piece of paper came from. And of course, you know, all the other things that played a role, the dirt and the various nutrients that were in the soil that allowed the tree to arise, and the sun and the rays of sun that come down. And when you see a piece of paper, instead of seeing just the piece of paper, we should ideally be seeing that sense of interbeing. And of course, it can go on ad infinitum because the sun also arises from its various causes and conditions, as does the rain, as does the nutrients in the soil, as does everything else. Everything contributing to the existence of something else. We live in this huge kind of Indra's net of interdependence, everything kind of reflecting everything else. Nothing stands alone. This is already pointing out to us the truth about ourselves, that we have this sense of an independent, standalone, self-existent I. And that's a fiction, because even that arises from causes and conditions. It's not some independent, existing on its own phenomenon. So this first level can already begin to shake things up a bit if we analyze it and really meditate on it. Kind of get that, wow, when I see something like, these flowers, I think these may be the same flowers from last week. Well, at least the same continuum of flowers. It's impermanent, so I'm sure it's changed. But the idea is that when we see this, we can understand that there's something more going on here than just this flower that is appearing, because the flower is a product of so many other things that gave rise to it. It doesn't have any independent existence. It exists only in dependence upon other factors. The second level is to understand the parts. Now, again, sometimes it's helpful to have something that you can actually pick apart. Actually, in my bag here, I have what I often use when I take this with me when I travel as well, which is, some of you have seen this before. So anyway, I'll get it out of the bag and then I'll take the camera off. This is dependence upon parts. Depending upon parts means that things have different parts. So again, those of you who are online, you can see that what I've got here is what we call a clothespin, right? Okay, clothespin. It has three main parts, right? It has the two wooden pegs, and then it has the spring in the middle. So we can say that you cannot have a clothespin without the parts being present. And certainly if we took away one of these parts, even one of the pegs, and all that was left was a single peg with the spring on it, it's not a clothespin any longer, right? I mean, if I sold you a bag of these and said, here, these are good for doing your laundry and hanging your wash out on the line, you'd be like, no, it isn't. I mean, it's not it's not a clothespin. Everything depends upon the parts being there for its existence. Now, again, we might be able to have some phenomena where a part or two can be missing, or maybe more, and we'd still consider it to be something. People lose their limbs in war and what have you, right? And they come back and they don't have an arm or leg or two arms, or maybe two arms and two legs. That we would still say they have a body, but nonetheless, we can say that there's got to be some parts there in order to designate it as body. The whole depends upon the parts, and kind of vice versa. The parts are only designated as being a part of the whole. So we have this kind of interdependence once more going on. What we think of as clothespin is something that depends upon these parts coming together and producing something that can serve the function of clothespin. Now, let's go to the third level. I don't need to show you the slide. If I do take these parts and kind of get them down to and again, and I also want to point out while I'm at it that there are other parts to these parts, right? You have individual little, bits of wood and the sides of these and what have you. You have the molecules that are underneath here, and of course the subatomic particles and the quarks and the subquarks and all the other stuff that they're finding as they try to go deeper and deeper to find kind of where does it all end. The idea is that there are infinite parts that we are dependent upon in order to have a clothespin here in front of us. Let's take it down to its three basic parts. Again, we have this one, which is the one peg. We have the second one, another peg, and then we have the spring, all right? So, is this a clothespin, the first one? Is this first peg a clothespin? No, right? I mean, again, I wouldn't buy a bag of these that are advertised as clothespins because I'd have a really hard time getting that to function. Is the second peg a clothespin? Same reasoning as the first, right? Is the spring a clothespin? No, getting everyone shaking their head no. Okay, so we didn't have a clothespin in any of those three parts. Now all we do is just a simple move here, and I'm not putting this up, it's not from up my sleeve or something like that. I'm just constructing the clothespin, putting the three parts together in a particular manner. So now do I have a clothespin? Where did clothespin come from? It wasn't in the individual parts, right? We analyzed it. Did I add a fourth part? Did I add something else to make clothespin? You might say, well, yeah, you put it together. Well, sure. But still, clothespin did not come from somewhere else. The clothespinness of this has to come from the parts, you would think. if it's there inherently. If there's something there that we can find that is the clothespin, then it would had to have been on the part somewhere, right? You would think. If it comes from somewhere else, well, again, there would almost have to be a fourth part that I would add that would say, oh, here's its clothespinness. In the end, what we see is that the only way that clothespin exists is independence upon that labeling, that conceptualizing. Our mind looks at this collection of stuff and has learned to identify this as clothespin. I don't remember when I was first introduced to clothespins, probably when I was a kid. My mother used to do wash outside, and she even had, I think at that time, clothes pegs. They were one piece of wood that you would just slip over that would hold it tight from the wind and what have you. But nonetheless, this is what we have now that we identify as clothespin. I think Adam Baker, who comes to the center here, he was traveling once and found an article on National Geographic that was about the history of the clothespin, and he gave it to me. I have it at home, but there was a display at the Smithsonian about all the things that we've used as clothespin up to what we use now. Anyway, that's a little aside. So when it comes down to it, the only way that clothespin exists is because we label this collection of stuff and assembled in this way so it performs a particular function as clothespin. There's no real clothespin in my hand. All that exists is the basis for clothespin in my hand that I am then labeling with my mind and calling this clothespin. Clothespin has no existence other than that. Again, clothespins aren't our problem. We're not usually attached to clothespins or get angry at clothespins. Where everything becomes really problematic, as I've been mentioning, is when it comes to identifying the I. And then we get really caught up in the needs of this I, thinking that there's a real I here, something more than being merely designated, merely imputed. So once we think there's something more than mere imputation, then we go after what that I needs in order to have its happiness and well-being, to be taken care of. And we don't realize that we're working with a false object here. We're working with something that is not real. So this is what's going on, essentially, at the deepest level. There's nothing more than imputed phenomena. Now, we have to impute phenomena. We have to organize our world. I couldn't be talking to you right now and communicating what I'm trying to communicate about emptiness and ignorance and what have you without imputation, without us imputing certain things to certain words and sounds that I'm using, that you then are connecting them with the object they're referring to and what have you. You're using all of that just like this right now because you've been trained to do so. But in the process of learning to do that, as I pointed out last week and mentioned earlier tonight, Rinpoche's little three-tier thing, we've come to hold things as inherently existent. Things have appeared to us, the basis for clothespin, the basis for flower, the basis for person. We have given those things a label. That's the first step. And then it appears from that side of that basis to be that object. It's got clothespinness, if I can use that term. It's got flowerness. It's got personness, I-ness from its own side. And then the third step, we believe in that. We grasp at that. But as I said previously, if we stopped at the very first, if we were able to just have things being merely imputed and merely designated, we would still organize our world and know what we're dealing with, but we wouldn't be holding it to be as real as we do. Just like remember the dream last week that I talked about. In the dreaming state, we are imbuing things with a reality that is beyond what they actually have. It's exactly what we're doing in our everyday life. We are giving things a level of reality that we think is there, inherent in those objects. And it isn't. It doesn't exist that way. Things appear to be real, but they don't have that level of reality. So this is what we're trying to undermine in terms of this. It's often called the reasoning of dependent arising, and it's called that because it helps us avoid one of our other wrong views. I didn't prepare a slide for this or anything, but remember there are afflicted views. There are 5 afflicted views. The first one was the one that we looked at. Remember, I'll put that chart up there that's got all of the mental factors that we've been examining. This is, again, the view of the transitory collection or transitory group, seeing that as a real I and mine. The second one there, afflicted views, item B there, extreme views. Extreme views are where we can fall, as we're doing right now with our ignorance, into thinking things have some sort of essence from their own side. It's a sort of eternalistic view that they've got something that's there that is existing on its own. That's one extreme. But then when we start hearing about emptiness, we might fall into the other extreme, which is a nihilistic bent, where we think, things don't exist at all. Don's holding up clothespins and pointing to flowers and doing all these things. And when I start looking at it, they seem to disappear. They seem to not exist. Well, they don't exist inherently, but they do exist. If we start thinking things don't exist at all, well, then karma doesn't exist and rebirth doesn't exist and Buddhas don't exist and nothing. It becomes a trap. So we have these two extremes that we could fall into. The king of reasonings is dependent arising because it helps us to find this little middle way between these two, where we can say things are dependent, therefore they can't have this independent kind of eternal existence, something established from its own side. They are dependent arisings, but they also are arising, so therefore they can't be utterly non-existent. So we refute both of these extremes through just the words dependent arising even, much less the whole reasoning. If things are dependent, they cannot be independent. If they arise, they cannot be utterly non-existent. So this is the way that we need to approach it, is to understand that there is a way to balance these two, to not hold tight to where we're at right now, thinking everything exists in this concrete, independent, absolute way, and also not to fall into this other extreme of thinking, but things don't exist at all. I don't exist. Nobody exists. Nothing exists. Well, and that is an error that people can fall into. It was interesting. My teaching assistant over in the master's program, Jump Gendon, he said that Lama Yeshe told him, and I guess an audience that he was teaching to one time, he says, for Westerners, because we just hold on to everything as being so concrete, he says, aim for nihilism, but then just peel it back a little bit. So, we do have to get pretty close to a nihilistic view to understand how things exist. Remember, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Lama Zopa said, it's almost as if things don't exist. It's really close. There's just like this little hairline that keeps you from falling into existence. That hairline is that we still have things existing imputedly, merely. Remember, I mentioned that last week, the mere I, merely designated, merely imputed, meaning there is nothing more than imputation, nothing more than designation. That's the way things exist. So maybe we do have to aim for things not existing at all and then just kind of go back just a hair, just to get us to that place where we go, but they still do exist, but just nominally. This is another way that we could refer to things existing by imputation. They have nominal existence. Nominal existence means there's nothing really concrete then. There's nothing substantial. It's just there's a basis and we are designating it, nominally giving it its existence. Yeah, the basis will have its existence, but the basis too, if we go down to it, and that's the whole kind of, turtles all the way down, it's almost an infinite regress. You can never find something that you can point to and say that substantially existence and everything else is built upon that. This is in a sense what I think these people and scientists that are looking for these particles and what have you going subtler and subtler. They're trying to find something that's kind of the basic building block of everything that has some sort of existence that you can rest on and say, that's it. The reality is there's nothing inherent that we find. We start with the I and examine that it's just merely imputed, designated to this collection of body and mind. Then you can go to the body and you see that body is just a designation we make to this collection of stuff. There's no real body here. And then go to any part of the body, go to the head. And the head is just a label we give to this collection of stuff that's on the basis of a skull and the skin around it and the brain inside and the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth. Then you go to any one of those, due to the nose. The nose doesn't have any inherent existence. It's a label we give to this collection of stuff right here in the center of our face, and so on. Go to anything and you just keep peeling the onion, they say, and you never find any core. There's no substantial core to anything. It's very slippery. Once more, that's why you can sometimes fall into that nihilistic bent. You think, oh, I kept looking for things and looking for things and looking for things, and I kept not finding. The not finding means emptiness. You are not finding things to exist inherently, to exist from their own side. That's what we are trying to learn and to develop deep wisdom around, is things not having that way of existing, lacking that. That's what an emptiness is. It's not something mystical or strange. It's how everything has always existed. We just don't know it. Once more, recall that when we looked at the definition of ignorance a short while ago, it was identified as an unknowing, but as I said last week, it's also a misknowing. We think things have a level of reality that is exactly the opposite of how they actually exist. So it's not that we just don't know, got an ignorance of this and ignorance of that, but it's that we have a mind that is actively misknowing things, actively thinking that there's a real me here and a real you and a real flower and a real computer and a real this and real that. And I'm relating to my world from that false perspective. That's why it's so crucial. That's why, once more, in this course, we're not just looking at some ideas of things that can make us feel better or have happier lives, and some of what we've looked at will certainly result in that. And even the wisdom of emptiness can result in that. But that's not the main reason why we have to understand this. We have to understand this and develop a deep wisdom of it, because otherwise we're going to continue to keep making the same mistake lifetime after lifetime, just going from existence to existence and never knowing any peace. Moreover, others are going to continue to do the same until we develop ourselves to a degree where we can help them to break free of all that. So that's what we're involved in here. And this is why this is such a crucial part of this course, is to really understand, what's emptiness all about? What are we really talking about? What is it that we are trying to refute? That can lead us into the next discussion, the next slide, which is the other main technique that is used. This reasoning of dependent arising can help you to loosen both of these things, the two extremes of thinking things exist in a more eternalistic way versus things existing in a nihilistic way. Those two can be refuted. So again, that third level, dependence upon conceptuality, that could be imputation, designation, labeling. It's not just words. I might say this before we go on, sorry. I mean, we do have this idea, certainly it's tied into language for human beings, right? Because we use language a lot to identify what things are. As I said, we couldn't get even to communicating to each other if we didn't agree upon what things are being designated as. But nonetheless, it's not purely language. Because I would say that certainly when you're prelingual, when you have infants who are coming out of the womb and they're learning about mother's milk and even what their mother's smell and figure is like, beginning to see their mother, identify with their mother, develop this healthy attachment that they talk about in psychology to the mother and to the father and what have you. When that's happening, there's concepts going on there, absolutely, right? There's a conceptual designation of, oh, that's the being who is going to take care of me. They don't have the language around that. They don't know mother yet, or mama, or whatever. They will learn that language over time. So words do influence the way that they are working with these various concepts, but they have those concepts even on coming out of the womb and beginning to relate to their environment and what's going on. Their concepts might not be very precise and well formed, and they certainly don't involve language, but they are still concepts. When a baby's screaming for, wanting to be fed, it knows that there's a substance there that it's been taking in its mouth that has been nourishing its body and so on, that it wants and desires. It doesn't have all the language to relate to that, but it's relating to that in a very raw way through a conceptual mind, a designation that again will change when they learn the language for that when they're older. But in the meantime, they do have a conceptual mind that is designating phenomena all the time. This is how everything exists for us. And of course, we also, even at a very young age, I would propose, I don't know the minds of infants, but I would propose that they are also infused with that same ignorance. They think that those things are real from their own side. In a very subtle way, they are clinging to those things, developing attachment for those things. Not the healthy attachment we're talking about, but the neurotic attachment, the desire, the craving that causes them to, get in trouble in a sense. So this is what's going on when we talk about this third level of dependent arising, is that beings are merely imputing, designating all the variety of things that appear to us, all the things in our mental landscape, all the things in our physical landscape. And that, in the end, is the only way that those things exist. A basis that is being designated as that particular phenomenon. So again, getting back to this idea of this object of negation, as we call it, what it is that we are trying to refute. This is one of the more common analyses that can be used on any phenomenon, but it's usually introduced in the context of working with the I, this sense of an inherently or intrinsically existing an I that we think is real here together with this body and mind, all right? Or even identical to the body and mind. We don't really have an innate sense that it is, but we have this feeling that there's a real me here sitting on the chair right now or cushion, whatever it is that you're sitting on. The very first step in this analysis is to what it says there, identify the object of negation. In Tibetan, this is the gakcha, which is kind of an interesting term. It's almost like a gotcha, like I got you with this. Gakcha. Gakcha means the object of negation, which is what we need to refute. It's the false sense of an I that we are clinging to. So we have to get very clear right from the beginning what it is that we are trying to get rid of, or at least, in a sense, come to see its falseness, refute it. So when we think about I, most of the time, we don't once more stop at that very first level of thinking, oh, I'm just designating I to this collection of stuff. Instead, once more, it appears to be real and we grasp at it. What is that idea that we are grasping at? We have to get really clear about how that appears to our minds. It's the same as that second step, that appearance, that false appearance and the grasping at that as real. It's the same object, essentially. So we have to begin to understand what that is, the sense that once more things seem to have something from their own side that establish them. So with every one of these little yellow flowers, they seem to have their own identity that is established out here on this basis, independent of my mind, existing on its own. And there are many different kind of, they call them hypothetical synonyms because this doesn't exist. We're trying to refute it and understand that it doesn't exist. But this way of things existing is being inherently existent, intrinsically existent, substantially existent, objectively existent, existing from its own side, existing by way of its own characteristics. Many different ways we can think about putting language around that, but it's around us all the time. What I was saying earlier, it's like it permeates everything that we experience day in and day out. It's how computers appear to us. It's how voices, sounds appear to us. It's how everything appears to us. And once more, how we grasp at it as if it had its own reality. It created itself. It set itself up. It's self-established. These are ways that we use to, again, describe what that's like. But I mean, they say this is the hardest step, this very first step, because it is a little elusive at times. But if we really think about it, this way that things are appearing to us is exactly what we are grabbing onto and what needs to be refuted. That there's something real, substantial there, something that has an ability to once more determine what it is, to provide its own identity. Now, it's kind of interesting because once more, we do tend to still, and this still happens with people who've been meditating for quite a while, even Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I think he was just doing this as a teaching for all of us, but he said that he would get to a place where he would think that he's kind of got a good understanding of emptiness. And he went to one of his teachers and he said, oh, you're still not quite there yet. There's one point of view that's just before we get to this final view that the Buddha taught, what's called the consequence middle way school. The one that precedes it is called the autonomy middle way school. The autonomy school teaches that there's still some sort of marker or substantial essence that determines that this is yellow and not blue. It's got to have, or whatever it is that we are thinking is inherently there, or this is a flower and not, a weed or whatever. So all of this, again, we still think that there's something from the side of the object that determines what it is, that establishes what it is. Otherwise, we think it all loses any kind of logic, right? Well, then this could be anything. This could be a green apple. No, it couldn't be a green apple because, again, it doesn't have the causes and conditions to be imputed as a green apple. Things still arise within the context of causes and conditions, and we have yellow flowers and red flowers and pink flowers and what have you, roses and chrysanthemums and mums and all the various flowers that exist. You have all those different things, right? The diversity of phenomena exist within the context of things being merely designated, merely imputed. But once more, we think there's something there from the side of the object that determines what it is. That's what we're trying to refute. As we look around, as we take in all the various things that appear to our consciousness, our various sense consciousnesses, our mental consciousness, everything seems to have a substantial marker, if you will, something from its own side that determines it's this and it's not that. Now, you still can, once more, discriminate between yellow flowers and green flowers and whatever, all the different colors of flowers. You can do that, but it's without things having it from their own side. Green is merely labeled. Yellow is merely labeled. Pink is merely labeled. All these things are merely labeled. They have no pinkness, no greenness, no yellowness from their own side, but they exist, designated as pink, as yellow, as green. Once more, that's the kind of the way you use the dependent arising to once more get you back to that place of understanding. If you start thinking, well, if I refute that flowers exist, if I refute that they exist inherently, if I don't think there's something substantially existent from the side of this basis over here, well, then they don't exist at all. Well, no, they do exist. They exist through imputation. They exist through causes and conditions. They exist through their parts. In dependence upon those factors, things do come into existence, but they don't have any substantial existence from their own side. So once more, we do organize our world, as I said, give everything these kinds of labels, designations, so that we can relate to everything. But as was said in that explanation, Rinpoche, immediately it appears back to us as if it has that from its own side, and then we think that's real. We buy into that reality. They often called people who don't have an awareness of that the childish, because we are like children who are holding on to everything to be real without really investigating and understanding how they lack that level of reality. This very first step is I need to be clear about what I'm negating. They say if you get that one right, the rest of the steps are a breeze. Because if you identify correctly what it is that we're trying to refute, what it is that we are grasping at through our ignorance, what it is that we are believing in our very being, then we can refute it quite easily. Just go looking for it. See if there is a real I here. See if there is a real flower there. If there is a real clothespin here. Right? But that first step, I don't want to talk too long about it because I'll end up spending the whole night, but it's so important. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has done a number of teachings on this, even when he came to the master's program for this first visit. I think it was in 2000. When we were studying Madhyamakavattara, the middle way view, according to Chandrakirti's text. And so we asked him, Rinpoche, please teach on recognizing the object of negation, because we do need to hear from these wonderful enlightened minds as to what that is, so we can then inform our own mind. So we're looking in the right place for this object to be negated, to be refuted. So he has given some pretty wonderful teachings on how to discern that. Because once more, we do have to go pretty far. Another way that Jampa Gendon, who I mentioned earlier, he used to describe this whole process, because there are different tenet systems, as I mentioned, that teach different views of this selflessness or emptiness. Some that are very, very coarse. The one that we are getting at is the subtlest. He said that if you use the analogy of like there's a very deep lake, but you're of course on the shore where the water is not as deep as you're going in, as you start moving through these different philosophical views of Buddhism, you are like letting go of certain things and beginning to float in the water, but you keep holding on to the life preserver of inherent existence, of this type of existence. You keep grasping at something that you think, if that's not real, there is no reality at all. That's how subtle it is and how much it permeates our way of thinking. We tend to think that everything has to be real in that way. It has to be something that makes this yellow and not blue. Well, there are causes and conditions that lead to us to impute it as yellow, but there's nothing from the side of this flower that makes it yellow. Yellow is our way of identifying what is arising through the force of causes and conditions, and based on our own imputation, our designation of the color yellow. Of course, yellow, one student was pointing out to me once, well, but yellow isn't really out there anyway, even in modern science, because obviously we talk about light and light being, bouncing back and what have you. I don't know. I don't understand everything about all the ways science talks about things, but regardless, there's nothing existing from that side of the object, but we falsely think that. We hold on to that. We think it has to have some identity from its own side. That's what we're trying to refute. The second step that we are working with in this analysis is to determine the possibilities for that. If the object of negation, we're calling it that now, but if that object that we think is real existed, well, what are the possibilities of where we would find it? Because if it exists inherently, intrinsically, from its own side, then we should be able to find it. Just like I did with the clothespin, when I took the three parts, and said, okay, is the clothespin in the first peg? Is it in the second peg? Is it in the spring? You don't see that there's a real clothespin in any of the parts. So this is one possibility that we need to refute. And let's go to the I. We have a feeling that there's an I together with this mind and body. Well, the first possibility would be that we would find the I, the real I, the strong sense of an I, to exist in this collection of stuff. And what Buddha often called the aggregates. So just his way of pointing out some particular parts of our mind that are involved, because four of the aggregates are mental. The first aggregate is form, it's our physical body. But essentially, we lump those together. We can say we have a body and we have a mind. Is that real I to be found to exist in either of those? I mean, do we find something that is the real I? That's the first possibility, and we're going to, of course, examine that in the next step. The second possibility, and we have to entertain it, though of course it sounds kind of outrageous, is that there's an I that exists that is apart from this stuff. Like Don, the real I, is out in the lobby there in the center, or is it out in this car or back at home or whatever, and the mind and the body are here. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but if we don't refute that, then that's still a possibility. So we have to examine it, as absurd as it might seem. We have to examine, is there something that is the real I that is not the mind and the body? Now, of course, some of the folks back in those Vedic traditions, they would say, yeah, there's the soul, Atman. Because the Atman is not the mind or the body, as far as I know. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Vedic philosophy, but that's a possibility for some folks, right? They would think that there is something here that is not the mind or body, that is the I, that is real. But for us, we can do simple investigation, but that's the second possibility, right? We're going to do that in just a moment. These two possibilities, is there a third? It's important that we come to a conclusion that there isn't, but let's take a look at it. The first possibility, again, is that the I is here, somewhere in this collection of stuff. The second possibility is that it's not with this collection of stuff, something outside of this collection of stuff. Is there a third possibility? I mean, it would seem to be a dichotomy. Either, I mean, if we use just kind of general terms, let's not talk about the object of negation. Either Don is in Santa Fe or Don isn't in Santa Fe. If Don exists, is he in one of those two possibilities? I mean, I could be on Mars, with Elon Musk or somebody. I would still be not in Santa Fe, right? That would be the second possibility. But these are the two possibilities. It's a dichotomy. Either you are here or you are not here. Either the real I is together with this stuff, or the real I is not together with this stuff. Logically, there's no third possibility. Again, this is a traditional kind of logical approaches to things. So if we are going to find the object of negation, which we've identified in the first step, that real I that we think is so concretely here, we're going to secondly look at the possibilities. It either is going to be together with this stuff or apart from this stuff, separate from this stuff, not this stuff. Then we go and investigate those two possibilities. That's the next two steps. And you can do it as an actual kind of investigation, analyzing for oneness, meaning that the I that we think is so real is inherently the same, is identical to something we find in this collection of stuff, the mind and the body. That's the first possibility. The second possibility was analyzing for difference. And by difference, we don't just mean that there's something else that is not the mind and body that we call, that is the I, because essentially the mere I, the merely imputed I, is different from the mind and body. I'll talk about that in a moment. What we're talking about is inherently different, meaning that it is utterly unconnected and independent of the mind and body, right? Because that is how we think of it. It exists on its own, self-established. Well, it has to be self-established apart from the body and the mind then, completely independent of the body and the mind. Because as I was alluding to, this is kind of one thing that Jeffrey Hopkins in his book, Emptiness Yoga, he said this and it kind of stuck with me. He said that if we can't understand this, then we haven't really gotten the full import of the whole thing around emptiness of inherent existence. The label, I, and the basis, the collection of stuff here, are two different phenomena. That's the meaning of inherent existence. He says if we're not really getting it, then we haven't really gone far enough in our investigation. Clothespin, the label, and this stuff in my hand are two different phenomena. Related, absolutely. Clothespin's the label we give to this stuff, but clothespin is not this stuff. This stuff is not clothespin. Clothespin is a designation to this stuff. And it really speaks to what we mean by a lack of inherent existence. But this is, once more, what we're trying to establish in this last one is something that we would think that we would be able to find that is completely, utterly, unrelatedly different. That is the I. So let's go through a brief analysis with these two. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm betting most of you have had this in some course, one time or another, and perhaps have gotten teachings from more realized beings than what I am. I'm not even realized, so I know they would be more realized than me. But the idea is that this third step of trying to analyze for oneness means that we have to see if there's something in this collection of stuff that is equivalent to the real I. Now, that sense of a real I, first of all, we do think it's unitary, right? When we were bringing that to mind, when I think of I, I'm thinking of a unitary phenomenon. Well, one of the faults we have right from the beginning is you have a unitary phenomenon I. Can you find one thing that is the I then? Because if the I is only a singular phenomenon, we have to find something that is singular that is identical to it. Even if we say we have a body and a mind, well, then we have two phenomena at least. Again, the body has many parts, mind has many parts. We have two phenomena that we are basing the sense of an I on. So is the I that is the body the real I? Or is the I that is the mind the real I? Which of these two is it? Or is it not there at all? Once more, this is the whole point of doing this type of investigation, is to see there's nothing that we could isolate within this collection of stuff, even if we just stay at this first level, the grosser level of body and mind. Is the body equivalent to that real I? Yeah, and it would have to be that I in all ways. Yeah, it would have to be this singular phenomenon that is identical to the real I. Doesn't seem so, because once more, that means that our body would be the I without even the consciousness being there. I would still be there even when my consciousness has left this body, and so on. We could find many different consequences. If the mind, the second phenomenon, is equivalent to that real I, well, then we would never have any sense of there being a physicality to our experience, right? Because the body would be not the I. The I is really the mind. So once more, you cannot start picking this apart and say, it's almost like once more going back to the clothespin and saying, well, the real clothespin is in the first peg. No, because then the second peg in the spring would be utterly irrelevant, right? Or the real clothespin is in the spring. Well, then the two pegs would be irrelevant. All of it, we start picking it apart. We don't find anything that is this unitary phenomenon that is equivalent to the real I, that is identical to it. And we can do this forever. I mean, because again, there are infinite parts to the body and the mind. We can go from the body. Well, first we isolate body and mind, look at body and see if there's something real here that is the I, that is the body, or any part of the body. Go to the head, go to the heart, go to wherever it is that you want to. You don't find anything that can withstand analysis. Investigate the mind. Well, in mind, you might think I have one mind, right? It's a bit singular. But you have 5 sense consciousnesses and you have a mental consciousness. Which of those consciousnesses is the real I? Well, let's take mental consciousness, because our sense consciousnesses are not always operative or whatever, but there seems to be some kind of stream of mental consciousness. Though, of course, when sense consciousnesses are operating, that may not be operating as much. But is that equivalent to the I? Well, once more, in your mental consciousness, you have a whole lot of stuff going on. We've talked about that in this course. We have the 5 omnipresent mental factors. We have the 5 object determining mental factors. We have all the other things that can be arising on the basis of what that mind is knowing and experiencing. Which of those mental factors is the real I? Are you your feeling? Are you your discrimination? Are you your attachment, your anger? So we don't find anything that, the further we go, as I said, it's like peeling an onion. You don't really get to this kind of substantial thing at the end that you go, you got this little I in there going, hi, you finally found me. No, the I is not really there. There's no real I that can be found in the body, in the mind, or even if we have this sense of, like, we sometimes use that term to make it a singular phenomenon, the mind-body complex. What is a complex? A complex means it's got a lot of things going on. Even though we use a label of like a unitary thing like collection or complex, it consists of many different things. So nothing can withstand this type of analysis when we start examining the body and the mind, start picking it apart to see, where's that real I? I know that there's a real I here because I believe in it and I'm guided by it every day to do all the crazy stuff I do. It's got to be here. That's the first of these 2 analyses, your third step in this 4-point analysis. Analyze for that oneness, that sameness. Is there something real that I can find there? Is that real I? Is there they often use the term, a true referent? Is there a true referent of that I that I can isolate and say, there it is, there's the real I found you. Who's the I finding you then? Ooh, that's a bigger question, right? Okay. The 4th step is the second analysis, analyzing for difference. Now, as I said, if we say that this is something that is independent of the body and the mind, completely separate from, unrelated to the body and the mind, well, there's a very simple way you can do this analysis. Mentally, take your mind and body off of the chair or cushion where you're sitting. Okay, so mentally, just set them aside. My body and mind are over there. Is there an I left on the cushion? Is that real I somehow remaining there as something different, completely unrelated to the body and the mind? No, as soon as I set the body and the mind off the cushion, the sense of I is over there then, right? Because now I'm over there. I'm not here on the cushion. There's nothing remaining. If I look at the cushion, there's nothing physical there. The body's completely gone. There's nothing mental there. My mind's over there, together with that basis. So I can't find anything. I mean, when we start saying this second possibility, something that is different than the body and the mind, of course, we mean inherently different. We might think, well, then I've got to go all over the place looking for it. I have to look in the closets here, and I have to go look in the kitchen and the dining area, and then go back to the offices, and then that's not even exhausting the whole building. And then I've got to go the rest of Santa Fe and look for it all over the place, and not just Santa Fe, but then all of New Mexico. And then I've got to look all. I mean, that's not what you have to do. You don't have to go looking everywhere for that real I to be apart from the body and mind. Just do that basic visualization. Think, okay, I'm going to take body and mind and get them out of the picture. Is there a real I that's remaining? And we don't mean a merely imputed I or the idea of an I. We mean the real I that we are convinced exists. And that's that first step again, is to get very clear about what that is, that I that we think is real. And if we can begin to undermine that through this investigation, because of course, if we find in our investigation, and I would challenge you, if you find in your investigation something that is the real I that is among the body and the mind, and what have you, or something that is the real I that is apart from the body and the mind, independent of the body and mind, let me know. I haven't found it yet. But if we come to the conclusion we come to is having identified that this is what we believe in, that we're going to try to find, and if we cannot find it, of course, we do have a conclusion we come to in a moment. We're going to identify where it's possible that we could find that. We're going to look in the two places. First, the body and mind, that collection of stuff. Secondly, completely independent of the body and the mind. The conclusion we get to is that it doesn't exist. And they sometimes use the analogy of like, if you have, two rooms in your house, and you know that when you come home from work, you put your keys, or wherever you've been, you put your keys in one room or the other, right? If your keys exist in the house, they're going to be in room A or room B. And if you look in room A and you do not find your keys, everywhere you look in B and you do not find your keys, you can safely come to the conclusion that your keys are not in the house. Right? If you've exhausted your looking, I know sometimes that happens, right, where we miss them in the process of looking in a drawer, and then we go back to that drawer and we find the keys are actually there. In this case, if your keys are not in either of those rooms, you can make the assumption that your keys are not there. Right? And it's the same with this. If we have looked in both possibilities and said, it's got to be among the body and the mind, that's the more likely one. That's the one that we're going to probably spend a lot more time meditating on and investigating, because that's where we feel the sense of I, right? I feel like I'm right here with this body and mind. If we go looking for the real I here and we don't find it, that's room A. If we go looking apart from that, which once more we can do through that simple visualization, imagination, we don't find it to be in room B then either. Well, if it's not in A or B, we can safely conclude that it doesn't exist. It's not there. So this is what we're needing to engage in, and these are the main two analyses that we use, dependent arising and then the 4-point analysis. There are other things the Buddha taught, which I'm not going to go into in this course. If you're curious about those, certainly the text I mentioned earlier when we were studying that Lama Zopa, when he came to visit the Madhyamakavatara, the supplement to the Middle Way by Chandrakirti, goes into some of these other analyses to determine, the same sort of conclusion. Do we find production happening inherently and so on? All these various things that can be looked at. It's not a lot of different investigations, but it's enough that if you want other ways of approaching this subject, you can find them, and they will all lead to the same conclusion. Now, I have to admit that this is one of the most refreshing things I found about Buddhism when I first started studying with the FPMT, actually. Because while I had studied a bit with another organization, I didn't really find, I don't even know if I heard the word emptiness. When I first came to Seichen Ling in San Francisco and started studying there, Venerable Rabino was like, oh, you don't know about emptiness? Well, get Jeffrey Hopkins, Meditation on Emptiness, start looking into this topic, da, da, da. And it was like fascinating to me because it was like really pointing out once more that this is something that we all can realize through these various analyses. It's logic-based. It's not like, oh, I believe in emptiness, and eventually emptiness will be reality for me because I believed in it enough. That's not going to get you anywhere, frankly. I mean, have some confidence that emptiness exists on the basis of other teachers who are, again, more realized and have some insight. But you have to find it for yourself. You have to go through that investigation. And the Buddha, again, taught these techniques to help us to get our head around this. Because once more, going back to what I talked about earlier in this course, our conceptual mind is problematic to some degree because we still keep working with things that are not the real object. But our conceptual mind is the key to getting out of this mess. If all you needed to do was just sit in some sort of quiet meditation and suddenly it would all change and your ignorance would disappear and what have you, that would be wonderful, right? Instead, we have to actually introduce this concept. We have to begin to get our head around it in an indirect way, coming to understand what emptiness is from a distance, if you will, through a meaning generality, a generic image. Remember, that's how conceptual mind knows. This goes back to what the second or third class of this course. You have to kind of get to a place where that concept is appearing to you really pretty vividly, where you really are getting it, grokking it, as Robert Heinlein would say, right? You know, you're getting it at a conceptual level still, but it's really quite accurate. You really have reached that conclusion. Then through deeper meditation, we can actually know it directly. Remember, that was the goal. I talked about how our mental consciousness generally is knowing things conceptually, but our mental consciousness can know things directly. The main one being, and the main one we're working on this path, yogic direct perception. Yogic meaning it's dependent upon meditation, yogas, and understanding things once more through a deeper state of mind, a more focused state of mind. And in that space of that mind, we will initially have a conceptual realization, but that concept will fall away at some point. What they say, and I'm not speaking from experience at all, trust me on this one. What they say is that when you have fine-tuned your meditation and gone through this process of everything becoming subtler and subtler, eventually this idea of emptiness that we have falls away. And emptiness and the mind knowing emptiness become like water poured into water, where you don't have any way of distinguishing the two. Your realization of emptiness is raw, it is direct, and that begins a process of removing the roots of samsara, the ignorance and all of the afflictive obscurations that are keeping you bound in samsara, eventually removing what we call the knowledge obscurations that keep you from being omniscient. These all will be removed through the force of these direct realizations. So this is, when I'm spending time talking about this subject, I prepared a whole bunch of slides to go into a number of other things, but I knew I would probably get stuck on emptiness for a while. But the idea is that if we don't spend time investigating this, studying it, reading about it, thinking about it, meditating on it, and really try to increase our meditative skills so we can have that realization, then we're never going to be free of all this nonsense. And moreover, others are going to continue to be trapped in it because we can't help them, because we don't have that wisdom and awareness yet ourselves. We haven't developed our minds to that degree. So this is the crux of it, what it really comes down to, and that's why it is so important to spend a bit of time investigating it. So I didn't get through hardly any slides. I mean, I just talked about these things. Let me go through really quickly, and then we'll have some questions. The opposite of ignorance is, of course, what we've been seeing with these virtuous mental factors. We had non-attachment, non-anger, or non-hatred, non-ignorance. Oh, that should have been changed. I'm sorry. It should say non-confusion. I will change that before I put these out there. Actually, I already put them out there because I realize I keep forgetting to put these silly slides out there. And so I put them out there, but I'll change that one. Non-confusion or non-ignorance is the opposite of confusion, ignorance, arising from an inborn disposition and nurtured by study, reflection, meditation. It acts as a remedy for confusion and ignorance and accompanies the firm wisdom that thoroughly analyzes the nature and specific characteristics of an object. It prevents confusion, increases the 4 types of wisdom, and helps to actualize constructive qualities. So again, this is from His Holiness and Venerable Chödrön's book, but this is what we've been talking about tonight, why we need to do this, develop our own non-ignorance, our non-confusion, our antidote to that through these analyses. So some of the antidotes to ignorance, some of it's going to include what we just talked about. But in terms of the grosser form of ignorance, where we have not a complete awareness or confidence in karma, well, then reflect on the law of cause and effect. Review the teachings on karma in the Lam Rim to deepen your confidence in cause and effect so as to avoid non-virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, and to adopt virtuous actions. And of course, to understand cause and effect is instrumental in all of this. We have to create the causes for liberation and enlightenment, or we're going to continue to create the causes for samsaric existence, unenlightened existence. Then, as I said earlier, contemplate the 3 levels of dependent arising. Analyze how the I, or whatever phenomenon you are grasping at as inherently existent, actually exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, parts, and at the subtlest level, mere conceptuality or imputation. Again, hopefully you've been introduced to that enough in tonight and other teachings you've had where you can do some meditation on that so you're familiar with that to be able to apply it when ignorance is there and you see it working, being operative, which again is a good part of the time. The last one is to use the 4-point analysis that we went through to cultivate an understanding of emptiness. Bring to mind how the I, or again, whatever phenomenon you're grasping at that time, how it appears to you at that time. Then determine that if it actually exists the way it appears, which once more is the object of negation, as I was mentioning earlier, there are only two possibilities. Then analyze for the first possibility, inherent sameness, and then analyze for the second possibility, inherent difference, arriving at the conclusion that the phenomenon is empty of existing inherently, intrinsically, what have you. We use this word inherently a lot, but it's what Rinpoche said, existing as a real I, as a real phenomenon, meaning that it has its own substantial identity from its own side. I'm going to skip these, go through these next time. Let me go to the mindfulness exercise. So having meditated on these antidote statements, you do have to spend some time getting familiar with them, or once more, as we've seen with all these other ones, when you actually are trying to apply the antidote, when things are coming up for you, you won't have it kind of at your fingertips or mental tips or whatever you want to call it. So as you see ignorance arising, either on its own, because sometimes we do just have moments of grasping at things in that concrete way, or even in conjunction with another affliction, remembering all those other afflictions we've looked at, anger, attachment, pride, and then of course everything else that is arising that we haven't touched on, all of those arise within ignorance. This grasping at a real I, things to be real in that way. Whenever that happens, apply any of those we discussed to see how they diminish the conception of inherent existence. Again, reflecting on cause and effect, the 3 levels of dependent arising, and then the 4-point analysis. Then the assignment for reading is to carry on with the reading in terms of, I still haven't gotten to deluded doubt and afflicted view, but we'll hopefully touch on those next week, as well as these close afflictions that are arising from confusion. The ones that are on that bottom there, the 20 close afflictions, are the last ones that arise from a combination of the root poisons, attachment and confusion, and then some that actually can arise from all 3 mental poisons, which doesn't mean that they're all multi-present, but it means that, yeah, any of them can give rise to that. Any questions or comments? We've got about, 7, 8 minutes or so. Anyone online have anything they want to ask? Yes, Jay, please.
It's not a question, it's a comment. This was extremely helpful. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Whenever people thank me, I try to, if not verbally, but mentally, just pass that to my teachers. I wouldn't have anything to say about any of this subject without my teachers. So I accept it, but they get the.
Okay, I thank everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's good. Let's go to Lorna first, and then Bill's got a question here as well. Yes, Lorna.
Yeah, Don, I was just reading or listening to a teaching on dependent origination by this master student. It's actually on the internet. And he came up with an interesting comment. He said a being is a temporary phase of dependent origination.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
That makes sense to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. How did you interpret that? And
Oh, I thought it was pretty cool. I thought, oh, okay, that's another way of looking at it or
yeah.
describing it. And it kind of encompasses everything, impermanence and
Absolutely.
continuation and everything about dependent
Right.
origination. I thought it was kind of brilliant.
No, I think that's a good way to put it, because as you said, it does kind of harken back then to the teachings on impermanence, and which, by the way, they do often say that before realizing emptiness, you need to realize impermanence, subtle impermanence, we mean, not the grosser level of impermanence, the fact that everything that arises from causes and conditions is changing moment by moment. We don't have that perception. Every time I hold up these flowers, they seem like the same flowers I held up the last time, right? But they've changed. In the many moments since I last held them up here, they've changed. And we don't have that awareness of subtle impermanence. We barely have an awareness of gross impermanence. Most of us live with this thing of believing it's all going to stay the same somehow, we're never going to die, what have you. But this is important to bring that to mind. this is, yeah, just a temporary phase that we are in the process of dependent arising going through, of when our existence started with our entering into the fertilized ovum of this life, through the when the body will give up and the consciousness goes on. It's just a temporary phase that we're going through, everything being impermanent, nothing that we can hold on to in an eternal, kind of eternalistic way. Yeah. Thank you. That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Lorna.
Thanks.
All right, let's go to Bill. And it looks like Ty's got a question, maybe too, his dog. Ty is up now.
I think you had one earlier.
Had one earlier, but didn't get a chance. So, okay, yeah.
So how does one apply the 4-point method to clear understanding?
The clear understanding. So again, is there inherently existent clear understanding? We do grasp at even our understanding of something, if we think we've got a clear understanding of emptiness from our own investigation as being real, because we haven't yet negated it in a deeper way through, and even if we talked about the clear understanding that a being who has realized it directly, who's had that experience of like water poured into water, does that clear understanding exist inherently? Well, does it exist independently on its own? It's a product of causes and conditions, a product of the parts of that awareness that are understanding it. It's a product in the end of us imputing clear understanding on that mind that is realizing it. We're not saying it doesn't exist. Clear understanding absolutely exists. The wisdom realizing emptiness absolutely exists. I mean, not absolutely in an absolute manner, but it does exist, definitely exists. But once more, when we go back to dependent arising, we see that nothing arises independently on its own. And that's what we're trying to refute once more with anything, any phenomenon that we can bring to mind. Whether we talk about these amazing virtuous states of mind, and the highest one being the mind that is realizing emptiness, at least with sentient beings. When you get to the Buddha's mind, that's obviously a higher object because it's realizing all phenomena at all time. But all of these things don't exist independently. They have no inherent existence. They can't set themselves up because, once more, they depend upon those three levels. Absolutely, causes and conditions. How could you develop clear understanding? What we are doing right now, hopefully, and the instruction I'm giving and the way that you're thinking about emptiness and what have you, is planting the seeds for an eventual direct realization of emptiness. It is part of the continuum of causes and conditions that will lead to that clear understanding. So you can't say that that clear understanding has some sort of inherent or independent existence apart from all the causes and conditions that will lead to it. Every time you read a book on emptiness, every time you listen to His Holiness teach on emptiness, every time that you meditate on emptiness, you are creating the causes and conditions for that clear understanding. It exists on the basis of the parts. Here we can talk about all the various mental parts. When you're analyzing things, of course, you have your 5 omnipresent mental factors there. You have your 5 object ascertaining mental factors there that we talked about. You have development of non-ignorance. You have all the things that are contributing to that arising, that awareness that we call a clear understanding of emptiness. And in the end, it's merely designated as that because it's not that from its own side. It doesn't exist on its own. It is designated as clear understanding of emptiness. So again, if we point to the way it does exist as a dependent arising, we can immediately refute that it has no independent existence and no inherent existence. Make sense? Did that make sense, Ty? Ty looked over here. Okay. I'm not sure Ty's getting it, but maybe Ty's a Buddha and I don't know that. But any other comments or questions? We got maybe another minute or so if there's a quick one. So again, I hope that nobody was, I mean, I apologize if anyone was expecting more than just to talk about emptiness tonight, but that's what you got. Sorry, I just get a little wordy when I start going into this topic. But again, this is something that we just need to keep fine-tuning our understanding of. I don't in any way feel like I've got a complete grasp on it. It's something that I still have to struggle with and work at, because I will once more often arrive, as Rinpoche was talking about his own experiences of kind of feeling like, well, but there's got to be something there. There's got to be something from the side of the object. Because even when we get into this idea that things exist being labeled on a base, well, we think there's something from the side of the base that makes us give it that label. Well, in a sense, we don't just, again, give labels to anything willy-nilly. We do come into some conventional agreement. That's what we mean by conventional truth. We've all decided to call these flowers and to call that a computer and to call all these things what they are. But there's nothing from the side of those things that make them that establish them as that. And when we start working with the I, that's where it becomes quite profound, because I start realizing that there's no real I here. And all the labor and energy and lifetime after lifetime of trying to satisfy this I has led me nowhere except continued misery. And if I come to see that that doesn't exist, then I let go of that. Yeah, I mean, you still have the causes and conditions of nurturing this body and keeping everything going and what have you. Or, these lamas who are trying to realize emptiness, they don't stop eating and everything, negate things in that way. That's not the answer. The answer is to understand how these things exist as you're putting food in your mouth, as you're, doing whatever it is that you do. That's why the awareness of emptiness can be brought to all of our experiences. You can live your life with an awareness of that and trying to become familiar with it, with everything that you do. But you first have to do the work on the cushion to come to understand what it is. Otherwise, you can end up with kind of a misunderstanding, not quite getting it. And then you might be reinforcing some levels of ignorance by continuing to think in that way. So try to keep correcting it, keep getting it closer and closer to that middle way, to that exact point of what emptiness is. And we can do that over time. All the great masters of the past have done it. They weren't enlightened from the very beginning. They all became enlightened through this process. All right. Sorry, I went a little bit over even, but let's do our dedication prayers. Okay, and I didn't even go to the text tonight. Well, sorry, Venerable Gyatso, but maybe I'll review that beginning of next week. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Maybe as an afterthought to this, think that all these merits that we're dedicating in this way are empty of inherent existence. They aren't real in the way that we think they are. The object that we are dedicating them for, our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings, also not real in the way that we think they are, existing merely through designation, imputation. And then finally, we ourselves who are doing the dedication, also not existing inherently, only dependent arising, dependent upon our causes and conditions, dependent upon parts, dependent upon imputation. Try to apply that understanding of emptiness to even this act of dedication. Where that's coming from, sorry about that. Let's recite this verse. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And I'm not sure what's happening, where that's coming from. It's never done that before. Maybe it's the clothespin. Anyway, I'll move the clothespin to the other side. Let's do the prayer for His Holiness. And as we do this, think again that we're creating the causes for all of our gurus to have good health and long lives, all their wishes to be fulfilled. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then the prayer for Rinpoche to return quickly, fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Page, sorry. Yeah, I can't seem to get rid of this noise, sorry. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And lastly, as usual, we can send out this dedication of this merits, all of what we've created, all the positive potential. We dedicate it in a sense for the welfare of all beings, but especially those that are in our hearts right now. People in parts of the world where there's great suffering that moves us, or people that we know who are going through obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died. Think about those beings and just send this mentally out to them, dedicate it for their welfare so they can be free of their suffering and also attain all the causes that will lead them to true happiness. And may all beings have these same results through what we've done here together tonight. So I just was thinking that I will post a transcript of those teachings that Rinpoche gave in 2000, I think it was 2000, at Sutta Lama Tsongkhapa, where I studied. I will post that out there. I'll try to do that tonight, and I'll try to make this correction. So I'm sorry I've been getting behind in some of these postings of things. In the course materials thing, when you go there, look for that to be there. I'll make sure that it's visible enough so that you can find it. But it's on recognizing the object of negation, and you might find it interesting. There'll be a little parts of it where you might think, I'm not really sure what he's saying, because it does get into some of this more philosophical stuff about the autonomy school versus the consequence school. But anyway, I'll be happy to share that with you if you'd like to read that and see what your thoughts are. So everyone have a good week. Try to do your mindfulness exercise as best as you can. And I will see you next Wednesday, if not before then. All right, everyone, be well. And please be sure to check up on Chorak Lama's teachings. Chorak Lama is here again through the month of February, doing all sorts of wonderful things. He'll be teaching tomorrow night, so feel free to tune into that. All right, everyone, be well. Thank you. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.